All right, welcome folks. As we stream in here, give everyone a moment to kind of filter in. I know the last session went a little later, so people are probably still taking a breather. We'll get started in a moment. All right. Well, I bet we'll have a couple more people come in, but we might as well get started and maximize our time here, especially because we got started a moment late. But so welcome to the panel on many dimensions of environmental justice here at the third week of the BARI conference. Very excited for a great conversation today, covering a whole lot of different topics. I'm going to introduce quickly the moderator and then turn it over to them because those are the people you're here to see. So Roseanne Bongiovanni is our moderator this morning. She is the executive director of Green Roots Chelsea. And she has essentially been an advocate and leader in the space of environmental justice, specifically in Chelsea and the surrounding communities for years, for 25 years. And so I can think of no one better to moderate a conversation like this and really push us to think about how our work in the research policy space can continue to have impact locally. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Roseanne and we'll be off and running.
Thanks so much, Dan. It's so wonderful to be with you all today and to be with such a qualified group of panelists. I'm really excited for this opportunity. I am in Chelsea at our Green Roots office, right on the Chelsea Creek and under the flight patterns of Logan Airport. So I apologize if at some point I have to mute myself or you hear loud planes overhead, but that's the daily reality when you live in Chelsea. I'd like to introduce our panelists and then we're going to just start right off. We'll start with Sarah Benson. She uses the she series pronouns, and she's an education associate at the Museum of Science, Boston. Sarah's current work is focused on engaging audiences of all ages about climate change, more specifically around extreme heat and sea level rise. Before joining the museum, Sarah was an environmental educator and worked on research projects surrounding marine policy. Sarah has her master's in marine affairs from the University of Rhode Island and her BS in marine biology from the University of North Carolina in Wilmington. I'm really excited to be here with Sarah. We've done some work together, our two organizations, so it's really exciting to be on this panel together. Next up, we have Connor Gately. He is a land use and transportation analyst at the Metropolitan Planning Council. He also uses this he series pronouns. He joined MAPC Data Services Department in September of 2019. His research aims to improve the understanding of the interactions between land use and transportation systems across the region. Really important to us here in Chelsea, so thank you for your work, Connor. He has a focus on mobility, transit accessibility, and travel mode choice. His interests also include the public health impacts of vehicular air pollution and the contribution of climate change to air quality and other health indicators. Connor's work supports the scenario planning and regional forecasting efforts of MetroCom in 2050, as well as other short and long-term transportation planning studies. Thanks for being with us today, Connor. And last but certainly not least, Nathan Sanders. He uses the he series pronouns. He's a data scientist, an environmental advocate, and an organizer in science communication. Nathan is head of data science at Monti Health, a flagship pioneering company, and a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard Law School. He has served in the offices of Mass Senator Pat Jalen, who is a champion, and Rep. Denise Provo, also a champion of Somerville, and collaborates with the Mystic River Watershed Association, which is where I first got to know Nathan. I'm really excited to be with him today. To advance water policy and environmental justice in the Commonwealth. Nathan is also chair of the International Leadership Team for ComSciCon, the Communication Science Conference series, and was formerly the chief scientist of Warner Media Applied Analytics and led the science group at the legendary Pictures. Clearly, our panel today is highly qualified, and I'm really excited to be with them, and I'm really looking forward to their presentations today.
Hello, everyone. My name is Connor Gately. I'm a land use and transportation analyst at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. And I'm going to talk about a project we worked on last year, looking at the racial disparities and exposure to air pollution from vehicles in the MAPC region. What we were primarily motivated by at the time was this rather stark evidence that people of color were experiencing both higher risks of getting COVID-19 as well as higher risks of experiencing severe illness, regardless of age, during these early stages of the pandemic and indeed throughout the pandemic. We were seeing hospitalization rates significantly higher for the non-white populations, as well as significantly higher rates of severe illness and death. And what we were as well as many others were aware of, was that there was this strong correlation between a number of pre-existing conditions and severe or fatal COVID-19 disease, and that these pre-existing conditions were also correlated with higher rates of some of the illnesses listed here, for example, in communities of color, including cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, and diabetes, and other immunocompromised populations. And in addition, we knew from previous research that there is a strong correlation between exposure to air pollution, and in particular ultrafine particulates, and lung disease and cardiovascular inflammation. And so we were interested in looking at where these exposures might have been occurring and whether they were related to some of the potential disparities we were seeing in the impacts of COVID-19. So these are very fine particulates. They're smaller than a tenth of a micron. They're generated from large vehicle combustion engines, primarily diesel fuel engines, as well as some from gasoline engines as well. And because they are so small, these particles tend to penetrate deeper into the lungs, causing inflammation and damage to lung tissue. And as I said, the exposure to these pollutants is associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease, pulmonary disease, and some of these other pre-existing conditions that were leading to high morbidity and mortality for COVID-19 patients. So what we did was we looked at emissions from road vehicles throughout the region. This was an inventory we had developed previously from a previous project that we leveraged here. And we looked at nitrogen oxide emissions because that's what we had in the inventory. They're strongly correlated with emissions of ultrafine particulates and from diesel vehicles in particular. And what we focused on was areas within 150 meters of the roadway edge, because unlike some other air pollutants that have a more regional dispersal pattern, ultrafines tend to drop out relatively quickly. They agglomerate or they get diluted. And so it's really the closest to the road where you're at that highest level of exposure. So we generated what we call the pollution proximity index. It takes the population of the 2010 census demographic data gridded to a 250 by 250 meter grid. And we evaluated the amount of population and the intensity of pollutant emissions within 150 meters of the road for each of these grid cells. And we scored the grid cells essentially in quintiles of the highest to lowest emissions. So the zero, the white areas are where you're more than 150 meters from a road. And then as the numbers go higher and the colors get darker, you have higher and higher levels of emissions. And when we sum up the populations by race and ethnicity in each of these categories of the pollution index, we see on the right, the far right column is the MAPC region as a whole by race in the PPI indice grid cells. And we see the disproportionate impacts quite clearly. Somewhere around 28% of white residents are living in the highest category PPI areas, whereas 45 to 55% of the residents of color, of Asian, Black, and Latino residents are living in the highest PPI level locations. When we look at the region as a whole from the perspective of the pollution zones themselves, we see the same thing essentially as the other side of the coin. The areas with the lowest amount of pollution, predominantly populated by white residents, disproportionately to their share of the overall population in the region. And as the pollution index gets higher, the share of residents of color gets higher as well. This is not merely a correlation with population density. When we look in just the highest density grid cells in the region, we see the same pattern. As you increase the population As you increase the pollution index, the population of residents of color increases as well, disproportionately to their share of the regional population. So this is consistent with other findings. This isn't a huge wake-up call, I think, to anyone listening, but we wanted to demonstrate it and make it clear just where it is actually occurring in the region. And that to emphasize, this is not a quirk of geography. There are historical reasons why residences of people of color are co-located with high pollution areas, from inequitable zoning and redlining in the past, decisions on the location of affordable housing, and in fact, in some cases, the siting of freeways and expressways deliberately through minority neighborhoods. And so going forward, we have to be focused on addressing the continued and persistent disparities when we are trying to solve the air pollution problem, to also be solving the environmental justice problem in the region. There's a wide range of things that actions we can take, both from the local level to the state level, including modifying retrofitting buildings to move ventilation intakes to safer locations, tightening up the building envelopes, adding high efficiency filters to the HVAC systems. We should be expanding access to affordable housing in areas that are a safer distance from high pollution roads. We should be empowering communities of color to have influence on the construction or expansion of roads in their neighborhoods. And broadly, we need to be moving towards an electrified vehicle fleet to reduce the source, the core root cause, which is fossil fuel powered vehicles emitting air pollutants on our roads throughout the region. So here are links to the data and the full report. I thank everyone for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Hello, my name is Nathan Sanders, and I'm delighted to be here today. I want to thank all the organizers of the Berry Conference. I'll be speaking about some work that Crystal Lee and some of our colleagues at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard University have been doing about how to empower advocates using open data. And I want to start out with a case study from my own town, North Andover. About 3 years ago, there was an incident where about 8 million gallons of partially treated sewage was spilled into the Merrimack River. So this is bacteria-laden pollution that was contaminating a water body that serves drinking water to 500,000 people. And when this happened, there was no public notification issued. Neither state or local agencies could verify the magnitude of the discharge when asked by reporters. And as of today, as far as I can tell, there is no state or local agency that lists this incident or provides information about it on their website or databases related to sewage discharges. And unfortunately, this event was not an aberration. This happens routinely in our state. This particular incident represented only about 2% of all the discharge into the Merrimack River alone that year. So this represents quite a substantial information gap for the public about sewage pollution. And since 2013 and even before, there's been a diverse coalition of legislators, NGOs, and advocates such as myself who have been fighting to win the right to know for sewage pollution discharges in Massachusetts. And part of my contribution to this work has been helping to develop a data-driven legislative communication strategy. So I've developed district level maps that show legislators exactly who and where in their district and among their constituents there are impacts from this type of pollution. And I developed one of the first environmental justice analyses of combined sewer overflows that demonstrates that there's a really substantial overburden of sewage pollution for disempowered groups like racial minority groups, low income groups, and groups that are linguistically isolated. So part of how I did this work was to develop a data portal called the Archive of Massachusetts Environmental Data, or AMEND, which is accessible at openamend.org. And this provides a variety of interactive visualization and analytical tools that help users access, analyze, and add context to public data sources. So I'm delighted to report that as of this year, as of just a couple months ago, the sewage right to know is now law in Massachusetts. This is a really substantial victory for our community. It requires sewer operators to actually meter and report out within 2 hours discharges from sewage overflows. And importantly for this conversation, it'll create a new state website that tracks and reports all such sewage discharges in the state of Massachusetts going forward. So this raises several important questions. How do we know that the sewage discharge database in Massachusetts will have an impact? And how does one know in general? How does one ensure that open government data portals will be used by the public and elicit participation? And how do we inspire advocates to engage with these data resources and to develop data products for the benefit of the entire public? So fortunately, we are not the first ones to ask these questions. There's an entire field of literature on open government data portals, or OGDs. So for example, a framework developed by Dawes et al. In 2016 describes open government data portals as part of an ecosystem of exchange of information and services between advocates and institutions that help to enrich the public policy debate and help lead to better outcomes. So we think Massachusetts is quite an interesting crucible to study this issue, partially because we are fortunate in our state to have quite a robust infrastructure of open government data portals around the environment. So since 2017, the Massachusetts Executive Agency for Energy and Environmental Affairs has maintained a public data portal. It's really quite rare. A recent review by Wilson and Kong showed that less than 3% of all data portals in the United States from governments address environment. And an EPA listing of states that provide data on enforcement shows that only 15 states do. While our data portal here in Massachusetts provides data on enforcement, on inspections, facilities, and much more. So we've been reviewing the literature on open government data portals to understand what we can add, what we can contribute by looking at Massachusetts. And we think part of this is around methodology. So a review by Ty et al. From this year, shows that the vast majority of these studies use qualitative methods primarily. So they're interviewing stakeholders, they're identifying individual instances of use or possible use of the data portal and reporting back on that. And we see that that is incredibly valuable information, and we want that to be part of our study. But in addition, there's a real lack of quantitative studies that use survey data from a larger set of representative users or potential users, and we want that to be part of our study too. In addition, Ty showed that a significant majority of studies on open government data portals are focused on transparency and accountability use cases. They're seeking to understand whether or not governments are actually making data available and not necessarily to understand what it's being used for. So we want to broaden that to look at participation, empowerment, and inclusion use cases, understanding how communities actually make use or could be making use of this data to create public benefits. And in addition, we're thinking of this in a data co-liberation framework. So to borrow the terminology introduced by D'Ignazio and Klein in the recent book Data Feminism, we're thinking of data portals as a potential mechanism for dominant groups and minoritized groups to work together to free themselves from systems of oppression. And we recognize that that involves a transfer of knowledge interactively between dominant and minoritized groups. And it views open government data portals as a potential piece of social infrastructure, as a mechanism for that knowledge transfer and for collaboration between the entire scope of a community. So one of the first things that we've done is to look at existing uses of the EEA data portal. We've identified about 30 so far, and we found that about 70% of them are focused on transparency use cases. So for example, we see real estate websites that provide direct links to individual site records for septic systems for houses in the EEA data portal. And we think those are great uses and clearly providing value to a lot of people. But we're especially interested in finding collaborative use cases, and we've seen just a few of those so far. So we've seen a few examples of journalists and researchers who are pulling data from the data portal and providing analytic outcomes back to the community related to policy or development issues. And we've seen, other than the Amend website that I highlighted earlier, just a couple examples of intermediary data products, products developed by people who are using and translating and adding context to data from the data portal for the public in a way that they can use interactively. So we've developed an analytical approach that uses mixed methods, both qualitative and quantitative research, that will be engaging a diverse group of stakeholders ranging from agency personnel themselves to environmental NGOs to individual activists in the research community, with a focus on users from the environmental justice community. We're going to be focused on assessing collaborative impacts, understanding how services are or could be built on top of the data portal, how they can be used directly by and engaged with by communities to create public good. And ultimately, we want to create actionable recommendations for data co-liberation using this data portal as a case study. We want to understand the usability of the data portal, how it can be more usable to more diverse stakeholders. We want to understand who is engaging with the data portal today and what social infrastructure could be generated to allow more people to engage with the data portal. And we want to understand its applications, what policy debates, what issues it's impacting today or could be impacting in the future. So we're really excited to share this research outline with you and some of our preliminary data. We would love to stay in touch. I have my email address on this slide, and thank you so much for having us today.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this panel today for this conference. My name is Sarah Benson, and I am an educator at the Museum of Science, and I am going to talk to you today about our wicked hot Mystic project, which is heat mapping in the Mystic River watershed. This project is funded by a municipal vulnerability preparedness grant, and we have some awesome partners on it, like Mystic River Watershed Association, Town of Arlington, the Resilient Mystic Collaborative, and a lot of other community groups, including Green Roots. So first, what is the Mystic River Watershed? Being from Connecticut, I definitely get confused, but this Mystic River Watershed is in Massachusetts. It is north of Boston in the greater Boston area. It is about 76 square miles and encompasses 21 communities. There's over 500,000 people there, and it is a great location to be doing this work. And what is the work that we're doing? So the project is all about collecting temperature. So we are collecting air temperature, humidity, wind, and air quality data in order to create a heat map of the entire Mystic River watershed. In 2019, we did this work in Boston, Brookline, and Cambridge, and we used temperature sensors to create a very detailed air temperature map of the area. So this is a continuation of this work to expand that map and have all of those towns and municipalities be able to use this data in their policy planning around extreme heat. So as you can tell from this picture, we will be using these temperature sensors that were developed by Kappa Strategies and the Science Museum of Virginia, and also the NOAA Climate Program Office. And these sensors include temperature, humidity, and a GPS so that you can gather ambient air temperature. So a lot of the maps that we currently have are more surface temperature and from satellite images. And so this allows you to really get an in-depth understanding and know how much the heat is affecting the area that we actually breathe and feel from day to day. So we will be doing this mapping in late July, early August of this year in 2021. It's going to depend on a day that it has to be above 90 degrees and no rain whatsoever. So we don't know the actual date of the heat mapping yet, but it should be around that area. We will also be mapping all 21 of those communities in the Mystic. So in order to do this, you need to attach the sensors to a car and drive around on a transect that we will create. And you need a driver and a navigator to go around 3 times during the day, 6 a.m., 3 p.m., and 7 p.m., and possibly another route either later at night or the next morning. And so we will be mapping all 21 communities, and there will be probably anywhere from 10 to 20 cars out mapping at the same exact time to get a full picture of the entire community. So to do this, we're involving volunteer scientists or citizen scientists to collect the data. It's really important to involve the community in this work so that they not only understand what we're doing and why we're riding around and collecting this data, but also so they have some agency and understanding of why this data is so important and how we can continue to monitor extreme heat and start to cool our areas down so that extreme heat is not such a threat to us. So other importance of this work, as I just mentioned, community engagement is a really important part. So we will be involving the community through a bunch of webinars, hopefully maybe later some in-person activities, some heat mapping, and using citizen science. And these data is going to really give a really in-depth look of heat in the Mystic River. So we'll be able to use that data to layer it with other factors like tree canopy, surface temperature, income level, elderly population, and emergency room visits. And it will show us all the hot spots so that we're able to know the neighborhoods that are impacted the most and where we should focus policy planning and resiliency efforts in the Mystic. So as I mentioned, we did this work back in 2019 in Boston, Cambridge, and Brookline. And so that data has been used for a lot of things since. So I just wanted to point out how important this data can be used. This is an example of how the data was layered with redlining data, which was a racist housing policy that is no longer in existence today. However, a lot of these redlined neighborhoods are still feeling the effects. And one of those effects is extreme heat. So we found that areas that were determined to be hazardous, or D areas, or the actual redlined areas, were statistically significantly hotter than areas that were labeled as A or B. So we found over 15-degree difference in some of these areas, and areas that were redlined are hotter than others. And this story was picked up by the New York Times because this heat mapping is happening all over the country. And so you can read a little bit more about that there. The University of Vermont and the City of Boston Parks and Recreation also did a tree canopy assessment, and they also found that there was a statistically significant correspondence with heat and less trees. So the hotter it is, the less trees there are. So that helps us to understand where to plant more trees and the correlation between the two. The data was also used in the citizen science in Boston Climate Ready Boston report. It was picked up by a lot of news articles such as WBRU and Boston Environment. So how can you be involved? This is a citizen science project and we need volunteers. So we need volunteers for the actual heat mapping process. You can see some of our volunteers from 2019 in this picture. If you'd like to learn more about how you can do it and be trained to help us out, you can head to mos.org/wickedhot. But if you don't want to be a driver or you don't live in the Mystic Watershed, you can still help us collect data. You can sign up for ichange.org, which is a free platform and app where you can post all about climate and tell us what areas that you're seeing extreme heat and what areas are great to cool down, or really anything revolving climate. You can post to IC for free. So thank you so much. You can learn a lot more about this project at mos.org/wickedhot. You can also follow us on social media on Instagram and Twitter. Those are all of our handles for Museum of Science, Mystic River Watershed, and NOAA Climate. If you'd like to contact me, you can contact me at sbenson@mos.org. So thank you so much.
Excellent presentations. Thank you all so much. Really enlightening. Sarah, I'd like to kick it off with you since your presentation was just up. So if folks want to get involved in mapping this summer and the heat mapping, but they don't have a car, can they do so? And just to build on that, we heard through Connor's presentation that vehicular air pollution negatively impacts low-income communities and communities of color. So could we do this a different way without vehicles? Could folks, map that data by bicycle, by walking, etc.?
Yeah, great questions. So that's kind of that's a yes and no answer. I obviously understand that using cars may not be the most intuitive way to map heat mapping, and we're also mapping air quality. So I get how that could be a little confusing in what we're doing. However, this method is developed by a national program that's happening all over the country. And in order to get the amount of data that we need in the time that we have to map it, unfortunately, you need to drive around in cars. There is an opportunity to do this mapping by bike, and we should be getting a couple of bike sensors to be able to map smaller areas like parks and other areas that cars can't reach. But in order to map the entire Mystic Watershed in the hour time period we need to, unfortunately, you need to drive a car. So yes, I understand that might be a little counterintuitive, but as of right now, that is the protocol for this process. But if people don't have cars, there are a couple of ways to be involved. I did mention that we will be getting some bike sensors, so you can help us by heat mapping through bike. We are also doing some air quality mapping as well. So the air quality sensors will be placed next to those heat sensors I showed in the video, that little blue PVC pipe that looks like coming off your car. So that will be on the cars, but we're also looking to map air quality throughout really just the whole summer. So you can attach these sensors to your backpack, to your bike, to whatever you'd like to be able to map more areas around. Another opportunity is through IC Change. It is a free online platform, either on your phone, on the web, to be able to communicate how you're feeling about climate change, more specifically for this project about heat, but it really is just talking about changes you see in your area. So you really just sign up for free and you take pictures, you post observations, and it automatically correlates or brings in all of that temperature data from the nearest weather station. If you do have your own indoor heat sensors or rain gauges, you can import that as well. And so it adds a lot more qualitative and quantitative data to our research. So if you're not able to help with heat mapping, we still want to hear more from the community about areas that are hot or even areas that are cool. What are areas you love to go to cool down in the summer, and how can we create either more of those areas or protect those areas as well?
Awesome. Thank you so much. We're working on a heat project, partly with you all and partly with the Florida State University School of Public Health. And some of our work will also entail photo voice. And I think that's what folks in Chelsea are most excited about, taking pictures and sort of showcasing them so that they can explain how they feel and see heat in our local community. So very exciting. 21 communities. So folks, sign up with Sarah. She's going to need a lot of help.
Yeah.
Sarah, there's I wanted to mention that there is an amazing video, sort of a little bit of self-promotion that our Eco Youth crew was part of with the Museum of Science. I don't know if there's a way for you to share out that link now or later, but that video was really amazing and our young people were so excited to be part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I can share that link. That was a really fun project to work on. And yeah, thank you so much to your Eco crew for doing that with us. That was amazing.
Yeah, they're amazing young people. We're grateful to have them. All right, Connor, the next question is coming to you. In what innovative ways have you engaged community members in the design tools to conduct your research? And have you shared your data back with those community folks?
I've been thinking about this question. You let us know that you were going to ask this question. I've been actually thinking about this for a couple of days, and it was kind of grinding me against my brain a little bit. This project, we kicked it off in the sort of early part of the pandemic. We were receiving feedback from all directions, not just from our local communities. Sort of everyone around the country was seeing these sort of stark disparities in the initial impacts as COVID-19 kind of swept in. And the first inclination is just to start digging into the data and try to get a research project together. And so, this research project kind of we put it together really quickly. We put together the findings, but we didn't particularly do a lot of engagement prior to doing the project. Right? We looked at what we had on the shelf and we put it together. I think in this specific instance, that's maybe not the worst thing, because I feel like this project really actually, where it stopped is where we need to begin on the issue. This project was really just about identifying the locations where sort of objectively you could look at the map and see the worst impacts were occurring. But what's really important and useful is not just to make a map and say, hey, everybody look at this map, right? It's to say, all right, we've identified the places that look like they're getting hit the hardest. Who's there? What do they have to say? What do they think they need? And can we help bring the resources to bear in the communities that appear to be most affected? And can we get guidance from them on what they think they need? How can we then engage with those communities to actually start fixing the problem? And so I think that's really the big step now, and what we've been thinking about a lot now is, what are the concrete actionable steps to take, and who are the people we need to be reaching out to and hearing from and empowering to kind of lead this next phase of the process, because I don't think it's really feasible or appropriate anyway to kind of swoop in and say, hey, we see this problem, we've got your solution, we're going to do this. And oftentimes that ends up with a lot of confused faces. So I think going forward, that's the focus and the main challenge is we did this initial step, but what we really need to focus now is who are the people in these communities that we need to reach out to and to be engaged with to drive the solutions to the problem. And so that's really the next phase, I think, for this particular project.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for acknowledging that. As somebody who's worked in environmental justice for a long time, we have a lot of relationships with researchers, and some of the research projects go really well and some of them don't go so well. And so I would encourage you to make sure that you're building trusting relationships with folks in the community, and really that the trust is them of you all, and that the information is used to guide their advocacy, but they're really leading the work, and they're centered in the fight and the advocacy. And that, I say this to all of our research partners, community members need to lead at all times. You all we're so grateful to partner with researchers because we wouldn't be able to advocate as effectively without that research, but really the direction needs to come from the folks who are on the ground, who know it. We all know it by breathing it, by living it, but not necessarily having the data to support it. So the marriage of the two is really strong. And so I look forward to seeing how your work progresses and who you're connecting with in community and how it leads to greater advocacy goals. Thank you, Connor. Nathan, the next question is for you. One of the things that you said in your presentation was things routinely happen in the state. And you were talking about somewhat untreated sewage. And that really stuck with me because Massachusetts is so highly regarded as so progressive, so educated, so far ahead of all of these other states. And yet in 2016, the Center for Effective Government ranked Massachusetts and only one other state an F, a failing grade, for citing toxic facilities next to brown and Black communities. With the data that you have, how do you feel that you could encourage folks in the community to take ownership of this data and to use it to effectively engage decision makers, state leaders, policymakers, et cetera, for change so that we get out of that failing grade and move toward A's and B's, which is where we want to be, right?
I think it's such a good question. And as a researcher and advocate, I feel excited to be in Massachusetts doing this work because I think everything that you said is correct. We're part in Massachusetts of a community that's really progressive, that has a lot of resources, that has a history of paying attention to, especially environmental issues, and taking action on them. And that's an amazing base to build on. But Roseanne, what you've also said is completely right, that we also have a history of injustice in our state and environmental racism, despite all those benefits and that great foundation. And so for me, part of this project, and the way I approach this issue is to think about the history of how environmental issues have been talked about in the political space in Massachusetts and around the country. And I'm really interested in being part of the movement that's trying to progress these issues from focusing on ecology to focusing on public health and human health and well-being to focusing on justice. And I think there's a great opportunity in issues like water quality generally and sewage pollution specifically to start to doing some of this mapping that Connor and Sarah are also doing with their work to try and identify what are the disparate and differential impacts of these different forms of pollution. What are the lived experiences and conditions of different communities in our state, so we can understand that, yes, there absolutely is a justice dimension to these issues that needs to be addressed on the one hand. But on the other hand, from a political standpoint, I think is also an opportunity to activate communities to engage in the environmental policy debate that haven't necessarily considered them as justice issues before. So I think that work absolutely needs to be done. And from a research perspective, I think that we can shine a spotlight on it and engage a more diverse set of constituents in the political process by doing it.
Excellent. Thank you, Nathan. Really appreciate that response. So I'm going to get a little dicey here, right? Our panel today is focused on environmental justice, and each of you highlighted structural injustices, right? And there is historic racism that's inherent in our society, in our government, in our communities, and yet all of us on this panel are white. How can you, your institutions, and we collectively recognize our privilege as white people and better center and uplift BIPOC community members? And I'll throw it out there, and whoever wants to take the first shot at answering that, but I'd really love to hear from each of you. I'll put you on the spot then. How about you, Connor? You can go first.
Yeah, no, another question that I stare at the ceiling in bed at night thinking about a lot. It's extremely challenging, I think, because of how baked in, a lot of these structural injustices in our society are. And none of us on this panel got to the place we are just because we were really good and really smart. It was more than just that. There's this whole systemic structure of the privilege that brought us to where we are. And it's not so simple as, you just got to go find a person of color who's also got a PhD or who's also doing research on this or who's also doing stuff like that. It's not like we can just go change the people who are going to put on this panel, right? It's about how do we get the people in these communities who could be any one of us on this panel today, how do we get them to be in the positions that we end up in, through the privileges and the structures in our society that provide us with those privileges. And so I don't know the answer to that. And I spend a lot of time thinking about it, and we spend a lot of time talking about it at MAPC. And I think we're all frustrated with the pace of progress, along those lines. We're constantly, discussing what we can do internally as an agency to uplift and promote and, provide, empowerment to researchers in the, people of color in the research community, people of color in the advocacy community, and to bring them more into the decision-making process that we go about when we decide to do a research project or try to frame a research project. And it's, I think we all just have to keep grinding, because it's difficult. And if we stop and if we try to say we feel like, oh, we've done what's necessary to kind of tick off the box of inclusivity on this project, then we've really only moved the needle a small amount. And I think it's just a sustained effort on all of our parts to constantly be questioning, are we satisfied with the people in the room today? Are we satisfied with the scope? What are we missing, and who do we need to talk to help us see what we're missing? So I don't have the answers, but every day I'm trying to figure out if I could, find another one.
Thank you. Sarah, do you want to go next?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I agree with everything that Connor said. I don't think it's hard for me to say as someone who is this person in privilege because of the color of my skin. But, for this specific project, and I think as the museum as a whole, we are really, we have a ton of work to do, of course, but for this project, I think involving the community and doing everything that we can to reach out to as many different voices as we can is a huge goal of this project. So, obviously a goal is to get this data, to map the data, to have the data, but this is also a community-led project. A goal is to make sure we are involving the community from the ground up of this project. We are just getting started with this, so it's a little hard for me to say, everything that could go past this, but as of now, we are doing our best to reach out to all the community members of all of these towns and cities, work with as many community groups as we can, work with pretty much every group on this call as well, so that we can all come together and really try to do what we can to involve every single person in the community, not just the people we may normally reach. So I agree that it's with Connor that it's definitely difficult. And I think the first step is learning and acknowledging the problem. And hopefully as we move forward, we can start to be much better about this. And I think that we maybe in our work have noticed this for the past however many years, but especially in this past year, everything that's come to light and everything that we've learned from this. And even with during Nathan's talk last year, we did a project, or I did a panel, I should say, called It's All the Same Map, where the redlining maps, the tree cover maps, the COVID-19 data maps, the heat maps, everything aligns up disproportionately. And how can we fix that? And we know this is now a problem. We're very aware of it, but what can we do moving forward? And hopefully this project is somewhat of a start to it, but it's something that I think that we can all work on and think about and keep moving forward with.
Thank you. Thank you. Jump right in, Nathan.
Great, yeah, and Sarah and Connor spoke so eloquently about this. I'm trying to think of what I can add. Maybe I'll just kind of narrow my focus to the subject of my study, which are these open government data portals. And if I take a step back, I think these data portals represent a really massive investment by governments all around the world over the last couple of decades. This has been a real interesting area of focus for policy and for new spending on IT resources for governments. And I'm a data scientist. I think that's fantastic. I'm thrilled that these data portal products exist. But I do also want to take a step back as an individual and as a citizen of the government to say, who are they benefiting? Now that we've built these things, who's actually using them? What impacts are they leading to? And what impacts could they be leading to that they're not today? And I think I'm trying to design a study that can help answer that for one data portal product, for one community in Massachusetts. But I think that's something that data scientists in general across all projects need to be asking themselves. And so when I think of the work that I do in other contexts, I want to ask that same question. And I think I'm an optimist by heart. And so I look at the landscape of research being done in machine learning and data science and actually see a lot of progress towards being introspective about this question and even applying the methods of data science to help answer those questions and measure those impacts. So I think there's reason to be optimistic about that. But from the preliminary results that I showed today and from other research that I've seen on open government data portal specifically, I think clearly they are not having the wide-ranging equitable impacts, return on investment from governments that we'd like them to have.
Thanks, Nathan. Sarah, I feel like you said it so eloquently that we have to acknowledge the problem first. And I'm really grateful that all of you see that each of us can do better in all of our work to make sure that our work is centering BIPOC community members. I would challenge you in 3 areas. The first is language justice. Green Roots is very committed to language justice. So all of our staff meetings, board meetings, community meetings are always interpreted into at least one other language, and pretty much all of our materials are also translated as well. And we've pushed state agencies, city agencies, even the federal government to do the same. I think if folks don't have an even playing field to understand the information, so much of the research and the data is just so technical in English. Imagine not being a limited English proficient person. So I would encourage you and your institutions to push forward with language justice and try to make sure that we're being as equitable as possible with sharing the information in languages that folks in the communities that we're centering really can understand. I would encourage you to engage community members from the onset, right? At the very, very beginning, let them lead with the research and empower them, right? Empower them with knowledge and information, and having them lead will help to bring out their own empowerment. I think one of the things that we try to live out every day at Green Roots is that none of us feels like we're an expert in any field. We're all learning side by side with community members and other folks, and so that we're all on an even playing field as much as possible. Though, of course, we have privilege, being white or being, a higher economic class, et cetera. So I want to transition into another sort of challenging question. So I am a lifelong resident of Chelsea, and I have seen just the burden after burden after burden after burden that BIPOC communities like Chelsea face, whether it's air quality or, contaminated water, limited access to the waterfront, more than enough impervious surfacing. Chelsea is 80% impervious. We have a very substandard tree canopy cover and limited open space, and we're hotter than all the than so many other communities. So all of your presentations, I feel like, did the same thing, right? It just outlined another problem, another challenge, another problem, another challenge that BIPOC communities face. And we can all sort of, in our communities, we can sit back and say, oh my gosh, we're victim, right? Or we can do what we know how to do best, and that's community organize. At the heart of all of our work is community members organizing for change. Just last night, we had our first in-person member meeting. We meet every single month on the second Thursday of the month. We had our first in-person member meeting with over 35 people. And we were outside on a site on the Chelsea Creek that we were designing open space where a dirty diesel power plant 10 years ago was being proposed. And we were out there like, whoa, see se puede, right? We can make it happen. We can gain public access through fighting, right? And organizing and empowering ourselves with knowledge. So I want to ask each of you, given all of your research, if you were partnering with community-based organizations on an organizing campaign, what are one or two targets that you would suggest that those community members identify to really make a change in sort of each of your programmatic areas or your focus areas for your research? And don't be PC about it. I want to hear you say, like, I would target this organization because they have the ability to make change, or this agency, or this decision maker. And I'll start with you, Sarah.
Yeah, so this is, it's something that we have been, we're kind of in that process right now, I should say. So we're at the very beginning of our work with this, and that's something that we're trying to do. So I will say from the very beginning, we have been working with a ton of amazing organizations, and everyone here on this call, pretty much. So it's been really great to be connected with everyone. This work is funded by an MVP grant, so Municipal Vulnerability Program. And through that, they are really working hard to bring us all together to make sure that we're on the same page with the projects that we're doing. And so that has been really helpful to learn more about what's happening around the Boston area, because I think as researchers and as community members, we tend to get lost in our own projects, our own thoughts, and we don't make sure that everything comes together and we're all working together. So that's a really great cohort of people. So we're working closely with Green Roots, with MAPC, Mystic River Watershed Association, Boston University, City of Boston, and City of Chelsea. So that has been really great. And I think that we're on that step. But for this project right now, I think that I would like to involve more on the ground community groups. I don't necessarily know what groups that is, but definitely people who are more work with the community day to day. So maybe not as virtual as we are right now. I'm very virtual, and I hope that soon we can do more in-person events like you were just talking, to really be on the ground. But yes, I would love to be in the community, really working with all of these cities and towns and visiting these areas. We were able to do that more in 2019 in Boston. I went to farmers markets and festivals and different community groups and city meetings, and it was really great. And that's been a little harder right now due to the pandemic, of course. So
but I think I want to
Yeah.
interrupt you just a little bit. So I want to spice up the question just a little bit. Who would be your target of change? So if you waved this magic wand, right, and you had all of the community members and all of the community organizations, as many people as you could, to be involved, who would they all be advocating to for a change with regard to heat?
Yes, so I think they should be advocating to the city and state planners who are involved in this project. They are the clients for this data, so it's something that they're thinking about. But I would really encourage residents and community members to feel comfortable to reach out to those people, to your city planner, to your representative, your state representative, or even your US representative, feeling comfortable to make that first step. It doesn't hurt to send an email, to write a letter. It doesn't, what's the worst that can happen? They'll ignore you. They'll say no, maybe, but at least you're getting your voice out there. So I think that is what I would really encourage. You can't necessarily always know there's a problem if no one tells you that there's a problem. So really using your voice to talk about it, to talk about these issues. I think that's what I would really encourage.
Awesome. Thank you. Sorry, this might be an unfair question for you all. I know that you're coming from the perspective of researchers, and I'm coming from the perspective of a community organizer, where we get together in a room and we put up a big power map and say, who's our target? And how do we line up folks who could influence that target? How do we reach out to those folks and make sure that that target is moving in the direction that we want them to? And sometimes we do it kindly with emails and letters, and sometimes it's protesting and showing up at their house, right? Connor, I'll toss it to you, and then Nathan will save that last answer for you.
Yeah. I mean, every day when I read the news, I don't have it on the wall, but I've got a big wall in my head full of targets. And there's a lot of targets for a lot of issues. On this issue, the one that I've recently been working on, I do think about this a lot, and I think there's a couple things that jump out kind of immediately. The vehicle air pollution is it's diffuse. Yes, there are hot spots, but it's not like a single power plant. It's not like you can go and say this specific plant is doing this to us. But it's not so diffuse that you can't identify kind of the major actors, and in particular with ultrafines and with particulates, it's predominantly sourced from larger diesel vehicles. And so who's operating and running large diesel vehicles? There are government entities, public works, the garbage trucks. There's the T, there's the buses. The T has done a lot, actually, has made some very good progress on cleaning up the tailpipe emissions from their bus fleet. Obviously, it's not them. We're not all the way there yet, but it's not like there's plumes of black smoke coming out of the buses the way it used to kind of be not even a decade ago. But so that's there too. There's private entities. What we saw in this pandemic was this tremendous surge of what was already happening of e-commerce, and there was maybe a month in March where I'm pretty sure the only vehicles that drove down my street were gray Amazon box trucks. And what's the status of those? Some of them are run by Amazon, some of them are mostly contracted. So that's a much more diffuse set of targets, but it's still a kind of a set of entities that I think can be legislated against, right? Or can be regulated. And I think that's where, in a lot of ways, you would be focusing as a community. If you find yourself in a community suffering from heavy diesel vehicle traffic, be it bus, garbage truck, delivery truck, idling deliveries at a front of a supermarket next to a school or what have you, that would be where you would start looking to basically have the community should feel, like Sarah was saying, empowered to take on anyone, and when they can figure out who they need to take on, we should be helping them take them on, whether it's the government and the planners who work in my agency who are on the other side of those MVP grants, or whether it's our partners in the city governments or at the state level. A lot of these problems are going to need to be regulated out. We're not going to incentivize our way out of these problems. So that would be at the top of my sort of list of initial targets, I guess.
Thank you. I like that you have a wall of targets. I do too.
Yeah, it's more like a big three-dimensional room in my head. So
I have a lot of sharp darts. Nathan?
Yeah, I'll answer again somewhat narrowly related to this subject I'm focused on these open government data portals. And I've been looking at the Massachusetts DEA's data portal as a case study, but I've got two very specific ideas that I think could be applicable to any government agency that's operating one of these platforms. And so the first is just to provide users with the capability to do a disparate impact analysis. So I think all three of us who presented today showed some version of a plot where on one axis we have the fraction of a population that's an environmental justice community, or the fraction of the population that's non-white. And on the other axis, we have some measure of a pollutant or an environmental impact. Very, very simple to do. Is applicable to almost any indicator of pollution or enforcement or spending that these government data portals track. Let's let the user community, let's let people make those plots and evaluate the disproportionate impacts on these issues for themselves. I think that could have a tremendous impact on the policy debate and can be very empowering for communities that want to understand, I think when we do an analysis like that, we transform what could be just a story about environmental tragedy to one that's a story about justice and a story about changing distribution. And I'll be very brief. The second thing I would suggest is to reveal public interest through these portals. So track what people are actually looking at, allow people to create their own views of the data, allow people to see the popularity statistics of what people are looking at. One of my favorite features on the Massachusetts legislature website is a feature that does that for bills. You can go to malegislature.gov and see what are the most popular bills today. And they're often extremely progressive, exciting legislation on topics like the environment and immigration and things that are never going to move through the legislature, to be honest with you. But it reveals just how passionate people are about these issues. Let's do the same thing using data, and let's look at it for the environment.
Awesome. Great. Thank you all so much. It was so great being with each of you today. I threw some hard questions at you and you all did really well. And I'm super excited to work with each and every one of you. And Dan, take it away.
All right. Well, I'm going to say very little more than that. Roseanne, thank you so much for leading us, being our fearless leader through this conversation. And thank you, Nathan, Sarah, and Connor for sharing your great work. I hope the audience enjoyed it. And that more will watch it. Roseanne, thank you for the hard-hitting questions. We love a good, strong moderator to push us. Absolutely love it. So thank you for participating and everyone who attended today, and have a great week and enjoy the beautiful weather. And hopefully you'll all be able to join us next Friday for our conversation with the mayoral candidates.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. Bye-bye.